Welcome back to the Great Compromise Podcast. I am GOP Jim, and as always, I'm joined by Victoria the Democrat. How are you, V?
I'm doing great.
Excellent. I am too. New year, new us, same podcast.
I think I'm the same too.
I guess we're the same, but it's a new episode. And today we are talking about media bias. So strap in, it's going to be a good one.
I think we can all agree that media bias has gotten pretty noticeable lately, if not overtly out of hand. Mm-hmm. I have a quote from Eric Schmidt, who is the former CEO of Google, and he was explaining how to maximize revenue, you must maximize engagement, and to maximize engagement, you maximize outrage. And that sums it up pretty perfectly, in my opinion.
Yeah, outrage sells, right? And ultimately, these media companies are a business, and we're going to talk more about that later, but they're trying to essentially get views so they can sell more products and make more money. It's a business. And so, yeah, they're going to say inflammatory things to get people's attention, to get clicks, to get views, to get whatever it takes, right?
Right, because if it's not sensationalized, then I might change the channel or not read the news tomorrow morning. But if it's really got me up in arms, then I'm going to pay close attention.
Yeah, we all say we miss when the news was boring, but we also didn't watch it when it was boring, right?
I don't know. I feel like there's a mixture of like this has always been the case and this has gotten so much worse, right? There's a long-standing joke that in Buffalo, New York, there's always a fire. Like part of Buffalo is always on fire because that's always how they like lead with the news. And then they're like, next up, there's a fire, on the west side of what, and it's like, okay, we've got to keep them interested, make sure you report on every single fire that happens anywhere. So it seems like, oh my God, our city is always on fire. And that's how I feel our country is right now. It's just always on fire.
Yeah. Well, I think in Buffalo's case, there was literally nothing else going on there to report about. Local New Hampshire news is, there's no fires, but there's, adopting puppies and things like that because there's nothing else to really talk about.
But that's a choice. If we wanted to have New Hampshire news be super inflammatory and about, like, the latest argument or, realtor outrage, like, that stuff is what gets front page.
That's true. Would you like to hear an example?
I would.
Of an outrageous fake news story that I found? This is a good one. I don't know how many of you remember the children in cages story from, I don't know, probably 2018. There was a lot of progressive activist journalists. I think Obama's speechwriter was criticizing the Trump administration about their treatment of unaccompanied children at the U.S. border. And in doing so, they were citing a picture of children sleeping in an enclosure surrounded by a chain link fence, along with an azcentral.com article titled, "First Glimpse of Immigrant Children at Holding Facility." Now, what all those people didn't tell you, and what the news coverage didn't tell you, is that the article and photo were from 2014, during Obama's presidency.
Ooh.
Yeah. And how many times did we hear about the children in cages? There were politicians who went down there for photo ops, crying in front of it because of how horrible it was. I'm not saying it's not bad.
Oh, it's awful.
It's bad. But what I am saying is that it started in 2014.
Right. It's misreporting. It's
Right.
not a new event.
Exactly.
And not a lot has been done to improve the situation at all. So
it's, I would guess, worse at this point. Nothing has changed for the better.
And I feel like that happens a lot where it's reporting for like a political bias instead of to solve the problem and bring attention to something that's not okay.
Exactly. The purpose of them bringing that up was to be anti-Trump, not to be reporting on what was happening at the border. And that's not right.
It seems like a media trend is to report things without context so that it seems more outrageous than it is. Like to take one sentence that someone said and make it a headline instead of explain the entire conversation. And so that's that's inaccurate reporting to just get to an outcome that's desired and is going to sell papers instead of, okay, well, actually what they were referring to here is something that wasn't as controversial as it sounds.
Right.
Like, there's this news story that came out about how Trump was saying that Obama started ISIS. And that was literally reported on, that, like, oh my gosh, according to Trump, Obama and Hillary Clinton were involved in ISIS. And people were getting, like, upset about it, which is obviously not true.
Right.
And, you know, to be clear, Trump says these things on purpose sometimes to get attention, to be saying something that's completely outrageous. But it's also the media's responsibility to report it accurately, not in a literal sense when something is, like, exaggerated or sarcastic. And so his point was that it's like the policies that led to growing problems in the Middle East that are responsible can be traced back to Obama, not like he himself was there causing problems.
Right, but that's how it was reported on.
Exactly.
Right?
Which is completely nonsense.
Right. Oh, I wish I could say that was uncharacteristic of the media these days, but that is, like, not even an egregious example. That's a common example, right? How about another fake news story? Remember a few years back, well, after Trump got elected, the media was all about Russia, Russia, Russia. Everything's Russia's fault.
Yes.
Well, September 11th, 2017, NBC News and MSNBC spread a story about that Russia was behind a set of dastardly attacks on U.S. personnel in the embassy in Cuba using a sonic or microwave weapon. I don't know if you remember this one. I remember hearing this and thinking it sounds sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
And also, how are we going to strike back? If Russia is literally attacking U.S. citizens at our embassy, like, this is a problem. And then I promptly forgot about it with all the other craziness that happened.
Sure.
Well, as it turns out, it's not true. It's not true. A team of neurologists began calling into doubt that these personnel had suffered any brain injuries at all. Instead, they appeared to have experienced collective psychosomatic symptoms. And that then biologists published findings that strange sounds that the U.S. diplomats reported hearing were actually Caribbean male crickets during mating season.
Oh, no.
Yes, that's right. Crickets. And
That's so embarrassing.
I'm sure that after hearing crickets for long enough that it starts driving you crazy. But how did we jump from crickets to Russia is attacking us with some kind of sonic weapon? How did we make that jump?
That's a big leap.
And lucky for NBC, I actually have a sound clip to back this story up. Let's listen.
Exclusive new reporting this morning from NBC News. Intelligence agencies investigating attacks on U.S. diplomats in Cuba and China now strongly suspect that Russia is to blame. 26 government workers in Havana had mysterious brain injuries starting in late 2016. And then this year, one U.S. worker in China was diagnosed with similar symptoms. Joining me now with more on this is NBC News intelligence and national security reporter Ken Delaney. And so this has been a mystery. The CIA, the FBI, other intelligence agencies have all been working to try to figure out what exactly happened here. Why do they suspect Russia now, and what's the evidence that they have?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. There is no evidence. It was nothing. It was all made up.
But the CIA, the FBI, they're working on this.
Yes, all the many trustworthy governmental bodies are working on it. Well, it's crickets.
Oh, God.
It's crickets. It's pretty embarrassing, honestly, that's what it happened. I think it's embarrassing for those news organizations that reported on it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just sad.
It is. Those are pretty big alarm bells to ring.
You can't just jump right to we're being attacked.
No.
You can't do that. Let's start with crickets and work our way up next time. Yeah, it's clear that stories like this getting retracted or have some kind of embarrassing truth come out leave people wary at best of the media these days.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. I found a study. The Knight and Gallup poll was collecting information, people's responses about their reaction to the media. This was released in 2020 before coronavirus and George Floyd and everything. So I think like this was data taken in 2019. And it says that nearly half of all Americans describe the news media as very biased. 71% of Republicans have a very or somewhat unfavorable opinion of the news media, while 22% of Democrats feel the same. In 1999, for comparison, 55% of people felt that there was a great deal of confidence in the ability of the media to report the news fairly, and today there's 41% of Americans that agree with that. So things are just going downhill.
For good reason,
Yeah.
I would say. God, it's just not trustworthy anymore. It's interesting that, 22% of Democrats distrust the media?
Yeah.
That means the majority trust it, or at least 2019.
Yeah, I find that pretty surprising.
I mean, this is my personal opinion. I mean, here we are on our podcast, so I'm allowed to give that. But in my personal opinion, I think it's because there are more liberal media sources. And so they're more trusting when they only think it's just Fox News being biased. Does that make sense?
I can see that. But also the problem with not being able to trust our media is that people are going to other sources, right? Like they're getting their news from Facebook or YouTube.
Yeah.
Or who knows, like we're not checking our sources the same way anymore because we don't know who to trust to start out with.
It's driving people to listen to Joe Rogan.
Yes.
Joe Rogan. Yeah, he has something like 11 million views or listens per episode, which is far and away more than probably all traditional media combined. I mean, he's getting crazy numbers. And I don't know if he is the most trustworthy person in the world. I mean, he has been spreading straight up anti-vax information lately, which is insane that he has such an audience and he's promoting the worst garbage. And so like that's where we're at. People are so fed up with traditional media that they're looking to people like Rogan for information.
And that you could be profiting so much off of spreading misinformation is really frustrating. Like if you're going to make this your income, then do it correctly, not just telling people what freaks them out so that you can profit from the outrage and anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, the regular news does that too. Like again, they're trying to make money.
Well, I mean, it's all a problem.
It's a problem everywhere, universally, which is why I'm surprised the number of people who don't trust the media isn't higher. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It should be like 99%. That should be the one thing that unites us as a country, right? Our distrust of the media, because it's pretty clear. And the most blatant example I have of this was recently in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. I don't know how much you followed that. I mean, I know I kept you a little informed on that.
Yeah.
But it was the most clear-cut case of media bias that I have ever witnessed, like to an insane degree. You would hear, I mean, from when the Rittenhouse thing first happened, and the protests in Wisconsin, was that last year or the year before? That was last year, right?
Last year.
Spring of last year. I'm losing track of time. Spring of last year, when it actually happened, they were calling him a white supremacist, a racist. He was shooting black people in the streets. He needs to be put away from law. He crossed state lines. He's a criminal who crossed state lines with a gun he shouldn't have had to go kill black people. Well, if you watched the trial, you know that none of that was true, and he was ultimately acquitted. But the damage had already been done at that point.
Right.
The media had done their job, and even after the acquittal, even if you watched the trial, which it was very obvious he was innocent, it was self-defense, it's too late because the media had already painted this picture, and people still think that he went to that protest and shot a bunch of black people, and that is not what happened.
And the people that were shot weren't black, right? It was a bunch of white people that were participating in the hearing.
White people who were attacking him and trying to kill him.
And who admit to attacking him.
And trying to kill him.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, but if I'm looking at just the headlines and not looking at the trial, I didn't watch the trial, I don't always read like the entire story because these things get overwhelming where it's like, oh, this week this is the problem. Last week there was some other, injustice, and it's so much. But if you're like me and you don't read in depth, then it's really easy to believe that Kyle Rittenhouse made a huge error and was just an awful person.
Right. I don't think you're alone in that boat. I think most people read headlines.
And that's the problem, though, is that if we can't trust the media, then where do we get our news and how do we stay informed? Because sometimes I don't know how much energy to devote to it, and other times, I'm reading varying sources of, people that lean in either direction to try to mix it up and try to find, my own middle ground.
Well, back to Rittenhouse. When MSNBC is saying that he's a racist murderer and should be going to jail for a long time, and then you flip it over to Fox News, who's saying that it was self-defense and he's a hero for cleaning up the streets. Well, what's the truth? When the actual trial is playing on live TV and the media isn't fairly reporting on it, what can you really do? Can you sit and watch the entire trial just to get accurate news for yourself? No, who has time for that? That's the media's job, right? We all have our own jobs and our own lives. I can't sit and watch every trial to keep up on what's happening.
Right.
So instead we get, he crossed state lines 10,000 times, the talking points that never end, and we never hear the truth. I actually found this mashup of a bunch of different people in the media saying how he crossed state lines to commit some heinous act. Well, in reality, it's not illegal to cross state lines. People cross state lines every day. He didn't carry a gun across state lines. His dad, he drove 10 minutes to go to a town where his dad lived and he worked to join in a protest, which we were told were peaceful anyways. So that is not a crime. Well, anyways, enjoy this compilation I found.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Kyle Rittenhouse was just 17 years old when he drove across state lines to Kenosha, Wisconsin.
The teenager drove from his home in Illinois
approximately 1 mile to Wisconsin.
across state lines, driving across state borders. He's driving across state lines.
Across the state line, across state lines.
Across state lines, across state lines.
If you look at the Rittenhouse case, he crossed state lines. Drives up to events.
Across state lines.
Came across state lines.
Kyle Rittenhouse, who traveled across state lines.
From out of state, out of his own state.
Came across state borders. Whenever you have a situation where a 17-year-old is crossing state lines,
White teenager.
he crosses a state line, drives 30 minutes into Kenosha.
Remember, he came across the line.
Cross state lines.
Cross state lines.
Across state lines.
He crossed state lines.
Kyle Rittenhouse, who crossed state lines, came across
State lines.
Cross state lines.
He went across state lines. Cross state lines.
Cross state lines and
Cross state lines.
a 17-year-old kid from out of state. He makes
out of state.
all cross state lines.
Cross state lines.
I should really stop going to Maine.
Cross state lines.
How dare you cross the state line into Maine? Don't you know that's a crime against humanity? It's against the Geneva Convention to cross state lines.
Young white girl in her 20s cross state lines just for a coffee.
It's terrible.
Oh my god.
It's really terrible. I'm going to play this for another 10 seconds, but it goes on even longer.
Cross state lines. Went over state lines. Drove across state lines. He drove across state. Had his mother drive him across state lines
Didn't happen.
from out of state.
The teenager traveled across state lines.
Carl Rittenhouse.
So, yeah, I hope you all knew that crossing state lines was a heinous act, so definitely don't ever do that again.
Just don't do it.
Yeah. So we've talked about a few fake stories and some bias, but like a story doesn't have to be false to be biased, right? How about some bias that happened a couple weeks ago? You may not have even heard that AOC, a very liberal representative from New York, was spotted at 2 bars in Florida without her mask. Now, the left has been railing against Florida for not imposing mask mandates or closing down the economy. And yet, there she is, enjoying her vacation. But that's not even really the bias I'm referring to. Do you remember last winter when Texas had their power grid go down because of the cold snap? Well, GOP Senator Ted Cruz happened to be on vacation when it was happening, and he was absolutely lambasted for it, right? The media went insane, saying how he's betraying his constituents by being on vacation during a state of emergency. Well, the criticism caused him to come home early. But did you know that there is a state of emergency in New York right now because of COVID? Well, apparently AOC is allowed to have her vacation, and it's somehow not a betrayal. And for the record, I don't feel like the criticism is valid in either case. I mean, AOC can't fix COVID herself. She's not a doctor. Just like Ted Cruz couldn't fix the power grid. That's not their jobs. And they both deserve a vacation, right? That's not the point I'm trying to make.
Right.
My problem is with the clearly biased reporting of what is essentially 2 exact same stories, right? State of emergency at home. A famous representative is out on vacation. One of them gets a lot of crap for it, and the other gets nothing. But, in other words, she crossed state lines, and I think that's the worst crime of all. Truly the worst crime of all.
Yeah, but again, the headlines when Cruz was on vacation during the power grid going down in Texas and the freezing cold storms and everything, the impression that I got and people I was talking to at that time got was that he left during the crisis to go on vacation, which isn't even the case.
Yeah, my understanding is that he was already on vacation.
Right, but it's reported as if, like, can you believe he just left to go to Mexico?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That is exactly the bias I'm talking about. And it brings me back to 22% of Democrats think that the media is biased and the rest do not. Well, I don't know. It's very clear to me in some of these cases. I can just see the bias oozing from these stories, and sometimes the silence of not hearing a story is just as bad as if you're hearing a story. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's cherry-picking facts to create the outcome instead of just reporting all the facts.
Exactly. Another case I have, let's go back in time 2 years ago, at the start of the pandy, the COVID lab leak theory, that COVID started in the Wuhan lab and leaked out, and that's how it came to be. That was once considered misinformation, right? You can't say that. You get banned off Twitter, you can't report it, you can't talk about it. Misinformation. Well, nowadays, of course, people's tones have changed on that story, and it's, well, we'll see what the future holds, but I'm going to go ahead and say it's the prevailing theory right now. Not that China would ever tell us, but it seems fairly likely at this point that that's the truth. And so the damage had been done, right? Like, we couldn't talk about the potential for where this came from because we were, whatever, banned on Twitter or whatever it is. And now, now you can talk about it. But, like, again, the damage has been done. It's too late.
Right. I think that we just need to focus more on reporting what's true instead of reporting what is feared to upset someone or lose readers or lose audience members. But that's going to lose people money. And the media businesses are exactly businesses. They're working for profit.
Yeah. I mean, in my opinion, for them, business is booming.
I'm sure they're doing really well.
It's going quite well. They can alienate some of their potential clients, customers, whatever, us listeners, the idiots who watch the news. they can alienate some of us and tell the truth and do some actual reporting. You know, like that wouldn't kill them.
It wouldn't, but it would really create some anxiety in their greedy, like, motivation of the numbers have to be better than last year. We have to have a bigger profit than the year before. You know, like, that's how capitalism works. It's not going to be, let's educate people on how to, like, push back against us or find better sources.
Let me ask you this. Is there a solution?
Taking more responsibility for what you're reading than just putting on what you always put on the news.
So you think the onus is on the listener?
I think that realistically, it's going to have to be on the listener. I don't expect the media to change.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think some people might jump to the idea that why don't we have a nonprofit media organization that maybe is government funded? Well, that's a problem as well. I mean, then we have, you know, China's media, and that's a different kind of bias. You know, under the current system, I don't know how it would be fixed. And maybe you're right. Maybe the onus is on us, the individuals, to take the time to do a little more research and not just blindly believe the headlines we read, you know?
But I think it's also not putting yourself in an echo chamber, right? Because then if everyone around you is like, oh my God, I heard that story and can you believe it? Then you're just building it up in your own circles. Whereas if you talk to people that you don't necessarily agree with and you get their opinion, then you can be forced to dig a little deeper yourself to figure out what's true.
You're right. I think maybe the actual solution is listening to this podcast.
You're welcome.
Yes, you're welcome, America. We solved yet another crisis.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Great Compromise podcast. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter for all of our updates and sometimes questions. We do ask the audience questions and stuff like that. So pay attention, follow us, and we will see you next time.